Welcome to Chapter 11, Voting, Campaigns, and Elections. We start with a couple important questions. First of all, is voting really important? Is the actual process of voting important? Or is it the right to vote that's important? After all, these representatives are supposed to represent us, and can we cause that to happen just by their concern that we might become motivated enough to vote? Also, most Americans claim to vote for the best candidate. Why then does party affiliation predict voting patterns so well? A theme of the course so far has been how the American political system is essentially logical. The logic of elections is that because the United States is a representative democracy, it's important that the people who represent us reflect our interests. Madison talked about the differences between a democracy and a republic. And I think that one of the things that's really clear is that he was not a really big fan of democracy, but I think he was a big fan of a republic. Delegation of authority raises the possibility of agency loss. Sometimes the people who are our agents don't even recognize that what they're doing might be perceived as agency loss. They're perceiving that what they're doing is what we would have them do if we only understood all of the complicated factors. But nevertheless, the one way that we can report back to them our approval or disapproval of their actions is by voting. Elections solve the delegation problem or help to ameliorate or cut down on the delegation problem by giving ordinary citizens a say in who represents them. If you're unhappy, vote that person out. Office holders will know that, and supposedly they'll do what you want them to because they desire to remain in office. They also give an incentive to the people who want to replace the people in office by encouraging them to change their views or to modify the presentation of their views in such a way as to encourage us to vote for the out party instead of the currently in office party. Nobody's going to care if we don't have the right to vote. The practice of selecting leaders by ballot arrived in North America right from the beginning. However, even in the United Kingdom and in the United States afterward, the right to vote or the practice of voting is very limited. This is called the franchise, or the right to vote by a group. And only about half of the free adult male population was eligible to vote at the time the Constitution was adopted. So when you think, well, only half of the people are men, and only a fraction of the men are white men, and only about a fraction of them owned property, and those would have been the people who had been able to vote. Even if you look today at the fraction of people who are able to vote, that's changed dramatically. And much of the story of voting in the United States has been the extension of the right to vote from a tiny portion of the population to a large portion. One group that wasn't able to vote were women. When we talk about the right to vote and gaining the right to vote, generally we talk about the franchise. The term that was the term of art when women were struggling for the right to vote was suffrage. And this is the power to vote as well. I used to have a quiz question designed to fool people. I would say, what was women's suffrage? And you give people the option of talking about, not having equal rights and things like that, as in suffering. Well, suffrage is the right to vote. Almost all white men had the right to vote by the 1840s, but women didn't gain the right to vote until the 1920s. Interestingly enough, when compared to the right to vote for African Americans, the right of women to vote was actually made real by the adoption of the 19th Amendment. Now, women had the right to vote almost everywhere except the South by the time the 19th Amendment was adopted. The same political pressures that caused states to ratify the 19th Amendment also caused them to allow women in state elections to vote. However, when you compare that to African Americans who had, by law, obtained the right to vote many years earlier, but in practice did not until later, it's notable that women were given the right to vote almost immediately in practice when they had gained it by law. When we talk about the right to vote in practice, African Americans really gained the right to vote not in the 1860s, but in the 1960s with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. We talked about that a good deal in Chapter 4, but it's worth noting again here. As we would expect, the concerns of African Americans were largely ignored in American politics at a time when African Americans couldn't vote. So one of the big arguments in favor of the power of the right to vote is the example of African Americans both being disenfranchised politically and being ignored politically in their policy concerns. We see here the Vietnam War Memorial, and it's because of this time, largely, that they decided to lower the voting age to 18. This is probably the most recent major expansion in voting rights and was clearly a political move. 18-year-olds argued they were old enough to fight. They were seen as adults when it came to war making, and therefore they should be old enough to vote. So, did the expansion of voting rights have an effect? Well, women, as a matter of fact, being added to the voting rolls had very little effect on the voting patterns in the United States. The states that had been Republican states prior to women's suffrage remained Republican states. The states that had been Democrat states before women's suffrage remained Democrat states. That there was even a difference in the distinctive pattern of women's voting was not really evident until the 1980s. Really, the main difference in the right to vote that we've seen with the increase in the number of eligible voters was that when young people were given the right to vote in the 1970s, that turnout dropped dramatically. The 14th and 15th Amendment did very little to end racial discrimination. So it's a rather mixed bag of just whether the right to vote has that much effect on politics. I say that, but it might be largely because of who uses the right to vote. So the share of eligible voters to actually vote has changed dramatically over the years. There was a sharp decline after young people were given the right to vote in 1972. Depending on whether you think 58% is a good number or a bad number, it's been a pretty typical number in recent years. Now, sometimes you'll get people will give you stories about really low voter turnout, But in recent years, there's been increased understanding that in the United States, there's a lot of people who are not eligible voters because they're new to the country. When we take our census and figure out how many voting age adults there are in the United States, one of the things that we often don't take into account is that maybe as many as 10% of those people are not currently citizens. And until they become citizens, they wouldn't be expected to, they're not allowed to vote. So we really need to account for a eligible voter population. And when we do, we see that about 58% of the people voted in 2012, about 59% voted in 2016, with a really, for us, pretty good number, a little over 60% voted in the 2008 election. How do individuals decide whether to vote? Well, age and education are important. Race does have a factor on turnout, taking all other factors into account. An exception to this would be the 2008 election, when we had record African American turnout, most likely because of Barack Obama running. In fact, just about everyone would agree. People with deeper roots in a community tend to vote more often than a more transient population. This has been much of the explanation for why it is difficult to get young people to vote. Although voting for young people has increased in recent years, social media being credited for causing young people to feel a little bit more connected to the communities in which they live. And of course, some communities have rather high barriers to registering to vote. In Georgia, for instance, you need to register to vote 30 days before the election. A surprisingly large number of young people aren't even thinking about a local election 30 days before the election. When you're a freshman in college, perhaps you've registered to vote in your hometown and you haven't paid attention to what's going on in the college town in which you live. Or conversely, maybe you've registered in your new community, but you've moved. You were in a residence hall your freshman year. 2 years later, you're living off campus somewhere. And these are all things that you need to take care of to be able to vote. In other states, you're actually able to register to vote much closer to election day. And there's even a couple states where either everyone is automatically registered, or you can register to vote on the day of the election, cast a provisional ballot, and if it turns out that you really live where you claim to live, you're allowed to vote. Different states have different priorities. One thing that really drives turnout is people's attitudes toward politics. Partisanship is something that people who are highly partisan are much more likely to vote. It makes sense in a way, right? If we were to think about the costs and benefits of voting, if you hardly care, why would you vote? You might vote, but you might not. I note that there's usually basketball games on during most election nights, and a fair number of people are probably watching that rather than me, where I start watching at 7 p.m. and I'm watching until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. Some people just like, well, who won? I'm interested to know. If you live in an area with active parties, you're more likely to vote. Men and women are about equally likely to vote. There are some racial and ethnic differences in voter turnout between men and women. The cynical and distrusting are as likely to vote as anyone else. Well, of course, if you're cynical and distrusting, that's going to motivate you to go and tell it to the power. This slide just says that people weigh the costs and benefits when it's cheaper to vote, as in it takes less effort to vote and it takes less effort to decide, you're more likely to vote. When the differences between the candidates cause you to be concerned more, you are more likely to vote. So how do you decide? So that's kind of tough, right? How do you decide? How do you get the information that you need? One way that you can decide is you can decide to always vote for your favorite political party. So if you base elections on the party membership of the person running, then you're able to look at how has the party in office done. If the party in office has done well, then you decide to keep that party in office. If you're dissatisfied, you decide it's time to make a change. Now, it might be that the candidate who's running against your incumbent is somebody who is not going to make a big change, or maybe somebody who would be worse. There's a cost to not doing all of the research. The question is whether that cost is worth it because of the time saved. Some people are what are called issue voters. You might not vote based on party or on the performance of a party, but maybe there's an issue. Now, it could be a bundle of issues, or you could be what's called a single issue voter. You make your decision based on one dominant issue. If somebody is going to do something, like if you decided that one candidate was going to harm people who you cared about, then you're not going to really care about, their opinion on, on bringing on bringing casino gambling to your town. Maybe you don't care either way about that, but maybe you do care if they're going to, say, crack down on, say immigration, if immigration is a big issue to you. Here we just have some key terms you might want to pay attention to. Opinion leaders. Some people have pay a lot of attention to, is this person endorsed by somebody that I respect? This could be anybody from your grandmother to a newspaper editor to the guy on television who you like. I say most people just look for a party label. So if we're going to take all of these together, the party label provides information about performance. We can lump all candidates from a party together. You talk about issues, the typical positions of the parties. Unfortunately here, this usually doesn't hurt us so much. Darn you graphic. But anyway, the party label is important because we can view it as an endorsement by the organization that we tend to associate ourselves with politically. As we've mentioned before, party identification is the best single predictor of how people vote in federal elections, and actually increasingly in elections at lower levels as well. In 2008, 95% of strong partisans voted for their own party's presidential candidates. And even in 2016, where there was a perception that stalwart Republicans were voting against Donald Trump because of concerns that he wasn't a real Republican, over 90% of Republicans ended up voting, or strong Republicans ended up voting for Donald Trump. So if you identify yourself as being associated with a party, since about 1952, about 3/4 of people who identify with a political party have voted for the candidate of that party. And in fact, this effect has tended to get even stronger, with 2004 being a high point at 85%. We're still right around that number today. The proportion of people voting for independent or third party candidates, between 1 and 15% typically, although right now maybe a really good estimate would be about 10% of the people are true independents. We talk about this, but there's still campaigns, and campaigns are still perceived to make a difference. You try to connect with the voters. You're saying, I can be your agent. You probably don't remember George H.W. Bush, but he was thought of as this very, very, inside government type guy, and he needed to show that he was just one of the folks. So he made a very big point of going fishing and eating pork rinds and talking about how he just loved Texas, even though his family was like a really rich New England family for many years. Bill Clinton played the saxophone on television because people didn't want to think of him as a guy who just spent all of his time sitting around thinking about government and politics. What could tell you that some guy was more cool that he played saxophone? Donald Trump puts on the baseball cap, right? Is he just this, really rich tycoon who, hangs around with rich people and pretty women? No, he puts on a baseball cap because he's just one of us. Now, this can backfire sometimes. I'm not old enough to remember McGovern ordering milk with his kosher hot dog in a Jewish neighborhood, but I know that that's not something that you should do. I do remember Michael Dukakis in a tank. In fact, he looked so ridiculous in a tank that it was said later that the Republicans had considered just having a picture of him riding around in a tank and having it dissolve to say, George Bush for president. But what they did instead was they thought that it would be more fair if they actually gave a voiceover on how he had cut the military, rather than just going, ha ha ha, look at this goofball in a tank. Ultimately, the key is getting out your message. The internet's been really good with this. For most of American political history, what the candidate has been trying to get across has always had to go through the filter of media or television, or been limited by the ability to buy commercials. Political debates are very important, but it's really interesting how the growth of the growth of technology has allowed candidates to get closer to the people to make a direct appeal. The next slide covers negative campaigning. Negative campaigning is an effort to show that an opponent is unsuitable for the job, either because of their political views or their characteristics. Negative campaigning is often quite effective. It's normal and very commonly used. Several examples of negative campaigning are apparent in the news even today. Everybody's always interested in campaign spending and campaign money, and this slide and the next few talk a little bit about the importance of fundraising and the laws regulating fundraising. Elections take money, and in the United States, The government really doesn't pay for elections. Ostensibly they do, but the amount of money in the presidential campaign fund is so small compared to the amount of money that's spent on elections. Typically, candidates spend billions of dollars, or at least billions of dollars are spent on their behalf. And so, the paltry, I think 60 million or something like that, that's given to a campaign by the government. If they agree not to only spend that money, you can't really run a campaign that way. The last candidate to do that was John McCain in 2008. But government officials and good government types have been concerned for many years about, exactly what's happening when people need to spend money to win, and then they need to take money from people in order to have the money to spend. Before the 1970s, there were very few regulations on campaign spending. That changed in 1971 with the Federal Election Campaign Act, which was extensively amended in 1974. A lot of people thought that campaign finance laws would be struck down by the Supreme Court. After all, it's a limitation on free speech. If you have the money, you should be able to say whatever you want, is a pure free speech argument. The Supreme Court case, Buckley versus Valeo, said that it was acceptable, not to limit spending, but to limit the amount of contributions received. The next attempt to limit this was the Bipartisan Campaign Finance Reform Act, also known as McCain-Feingold, that was passed in 2002. But interestingly enough, in a couple Supreme Court cases, this was struck down. And we see today that as long as you're not spending money in coordination with a candidate, you can set up what's called a super PAC and spend however much money advocating for candidates and issues in elections. And what we see quite often are that millions and millions of dollars are spent outside the control of candidates. Candidates go around saying things, and then the outside expenditures tend to echo what they're saying, and also, as I was mentioning before, run a series of negative campaign ads against political opponents. Sometimes when we have a lot of time and we're face-to-face in class, I talk about, where all the campaign money comes from. So there are many rules regarding campaign financing. When it relates to coordinated expenditures, these are expenditures where there's an agreement between the candidates and parties and others, and this is highly regulated. Independent expenditures are not regulated. Contributions tend to favor winners. If you're going to contribute money, you probably want to give it to the incumbent because the incumbent almost always wins, and you don't want to antagonize him by giving to his opponent, and it might help you to give to the incumbent himself. Candidates for open seats are usually in a much better position. That's why some of these are the most highly contested of our elections. This slide talks about how the election rules, like the Electoral College and stuff, influence a lot on where the money's spent. There's certainly no reason why a political candidate would spend like a Republican would spend an awful lot of money to try to win votes in a community where they're going to get 10% of the vote. It's much more useful to try to win votes in a community where you're right around 50%, or even in a community where you have 90% or 80% of the vote, to get as many people out as possible. we see our elections increasingly as being efforts to turn out the base or the core supporters, make sure that everybody shows up. Here's just some summary of what we've been talking about. All right, I wish you all well. I'm looking forward to I'm looking forward to seeing how well we're going to all do on the final exams. I hope you're all hanging in there. If any of you have any problems that would need to be addressed before the final exam, or you need help in some way, or there's something that you don't understand, I strongly encourage you to contact me, and I'll help as much as I can. Thanks.